Good afternoon, friends and comrades. I'm Samir AMIN speaking. I'm the chair of the World Forum for Alternatives. I am just back from Tunis, where there was held the World Forum, the World Social Forum, and I will address three questions. One, what was the polycentric system of after World War II? And the place of Bandung and the non-aligned movement in that system from 1945, say, to 1980 or 85. Then, second, what is the world without Bandung since that we have, and which is still going on for the majority of countries of the South? And third, what are the conditions for a renewal of a polycentric system with no hegemony as of now? First, my reading of the period of after World War II is not the common reading which is suggested by the dominant Western medias. The Western medias present the period of after World War II as a period of bipolarity, two actors, the United States and Soviet Union, and a military bipolarity. It was, as they call it, the period of Cold War. Now, this is a very wrong presentation of the period. The period was, in fact, a period of polycentric world, polycentric politically, economically, and socially. Even if there was also a relative bipolarity at the military level, at the level of armaments, particularly nuclear armaments. But it was a polycentric system. The period was characterized by three sets of social systems, different from one another, in competition, perhaps also marginally in conflict, but also which were complementary one to the other. There was a social democratic pattern of in the United States and Western Europe, and even to some extent in Japan, a real social democracy, which was a historical compromise between capital and labor, and which allowed high rates of growth in the Western countries after the reconstructions of the destructions of the war, and a relatively stable distribution of income. There was no growing inequality, but relatively stable distribution of income. There was, second, the socialist patterns, the really existing socialist patterns. I use plural here. There was the Soviet pattern of post-World War II, but there was also the Maoist Chinese pattern, quite different from the Soviet pattern, in spite of the alliance, political alliance for a time between the two superpowers of the socialist world. But there was also a third series of experiences, which I call national popular, and which came out in Asia and Africa, and which came out precisely of the Bandung meeting 1955, 60 years ago, and the non-alignment movement, which was created a few years later in 1960 as a result of Bandung. This pattern, this diversity of patterns of development allowed for all partners to, they enjoyed a margin of maneuver which allowed for relatively better patterns of development than the one we had after. Better patterns, I'm not saying that it was beautiful, that it was perfect, that there was no contradiction, of course not. But you had high growth with relative no change in the distribution of income in the West. You have the fundamentals for the industrialization which were pursued by the Soviet Union after the reconstruction, and which were started in China in the Maoist period as of 1949. And there was a series of attempts of moving towards industrialization, unequal, of course, in many countries of the south of Bandung, of the non-aligned movement. Now, this was a polycentric world. There was bipolarity, but it was polycentric at the political and social level. Now, what has happened is Bandung was we should never forget that Chou Enlai was a founding member of Bandung, and that he had quite a high influence on Bandung. And China, I mean, through Chou Enlai. But we should know that the Bandung states and the non-aligned state, we ought now to complete the independence, political independence, which we have reconquered by throwing away the colonial systems, the previous patterns of colonial or semi-colonial systems. We should complete it by economic independence. I'm using the word independence. That is choosing the pattern of development, moving into modernization of agriculture, of starting industrialization, and using the margin of maneuver to have, in many cases, something close to state capitalist systems, but with a popular content, with social progressive reforms, land reforms and other reforms, nationalization of big industries and trade, etc., etc. Now, that allowed these systems characterize the post-war II period, and Bandung find its place in that frame. Now, there were, of course, contradictions and within the system, each of those systems, but they were coexisting also. This multipolar system allowed for the countries of the South to establish the group of 77. They are 77 plus China in the United Nations, and also a series of organization of political and including in some cases military solidarity facing the aggressions of imperialism. Now, what the Soviet Union understood at that time is that this was an opportunity for them to move out of the seclusion in which they have been compelled by imperialism since the Russian Revolution, 1917. So, in my reading, the Cold War is not after World War II. The Cold War against the Soviet Union started in 1917 and did not discontinue throughout the history of the Soviet Union until 1990 or 91, and is even continuing now against Russia. Now, that was the attitude, and therefore there was a rapprochement coming closer, if not an alliance, in some cases alliances between Soviet Union and on the one hand, and of China on the other hand, and many countries of the non-aligned movement. And everybody benefited from that because there was a margin of maneuver which allowed for patterns of development. But those patterns of development had their own limits. I'm stressing on the group of non-aligned, which was that they were national, popular, but things were done from top to bottom. That is, reforms from top, decided by the governments, and to the benefit, not necessarily of everybody, but to the benefit of a growing middle class, which did not exist previously or was very small in most countries of the South. Now, because of those limits, that is a pattern of development within globalization. You see, globalization is not just what we have now. Globalization, it was a pattern of globalization, but with multipolarity and with room of maneuver. I would call it negotiated globalization between the three sets of partners, the Western imperialist but simultaneously social democrat societies, the really existing socialism of Soviet Union and China, and the variety of national popular patterns of development. Nasser in Egypt was typical of that, but also Sukarno in Indonesia, and we had a large number of experience of that kind. Now, because of its own limitation, internal limitation, the three patterns came out of steam within 30 or 40 years. It's not only the Soviet model which came out of steam and finally broke down brutally in 1990, as you know, but it was also to take China, the Maoist formula, which was the condition for the present success of China, which reached its own limits, but it was also the variety of national popular systems which reached its limits. It was also the social democracy in the West which reached its limits. That created the condition for a counter-offensive of the historical imperialist bloc, that is United States, Europe, and Japan, the triad, and to, as of 1981 in Cancun, when President Reagan of the United States said, "We know better than them," meaning the countries of the South and of the East, what they need, which means another pattern of globalization, unipolar, and the pole is the United States with its allies of Western Central Europe and Japan, and re-establishing its domination not only over the whole South, but also over the previous Soviet system, starting with Eastern Europe and now attacking Russia through the attack on Ukraine, and even the attempt, but that is not giving brilliant result from the West, the attempt to impose upon China to submit to the pattern of globalization. Now, we enter therefore into a second period, a world without Bandung, a world which is a new imperialist. I'm calling it the collective imperialism of the triad, U.S., Europe, and Japan. A world without Bandung, that is a world in which everybody is compelled to accept the rules established exclusively by the Western imperialist bloc. That is the uncontrolled opening, not only to trade, but also to the financial flows, not only capital investments, but also financial flows of all sorts, and the plunder of the natural resources of the whole planet to the exclusive benefit or almost exclusive benefit of the Western powers and societies, etc., etc. That is awful. But I have always said that this system, which presented itself as the end of history, as synonymous to a new long period with peace and economic development under the market rule, this system was not viable. I always considered that it was not viable. Well, it survived 30 or 40 years, but that is a short period in history, because it immediately created everywhere dramatic social disasters, with growing inequality, with growth being moving down, and whenever there was a high rate of growth, it was due to the plunder of natural resources, and very little more than that. With the dismantling of the attempts of modernization of agriculture and start of industrialization, a pattern, a social disaster. That social disaster, we can see it everywhere in the world. That is in the north as well as in the south, with growing inequality in the distribution of income. But there are differences between here and there. In the Western countries, in the imperialist triad, it has this long crisis have started not just in 2008 with the financial breakdown, but long before, in the middle of the 70s of last century, when the rates of growth and investment, productive investment, fall down to half of what they had been before during the 30 years which followed World War II. Second, and therefore this is a long systemic crisis with new dimensions, of course, with the ecological dimension and other, but it's a deep financial, not only financial crisis, but systemic crisis. But we had also the breakdown of the Soviet Union, which is the end of the pattern of Soviet socialism. We had also the change in China after the death of Mao, but even later after the period of Deng Xiaoping, starting from the 1990s, the involvement in China in the new globalization, but with limits. That is, China is not just a partner, is not just integrated in the global system as it is, but it has also maintained its own project of modernization and of industrialization, a national independent project which is associated with the participating to the globalization. That leads to another pattern, a new pattern. Call it as you want. I call it a kind of state capitalism with a social dimension, with a social, I'm not saying socialist, which could be a stage toward a market socialism, or socialism with market, which is itself is a stage towards a higher level of socialism. But anyway, in all or almost all countries except China and Japan, of course, which belongs to the imperialist countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, then we had, through the programs of structural adjustment, the total destruction of the national relatively autonomous patterns which had been built before. And that was led to a tremendous social disasters, among which the acceleration of the dispossession of hundreds of millions of peasants, which associate, along with no industrialization, that is moving into the slums of cities. I mean, we beginning constructing a planet of slums in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, and the loss of political room of maneuver for the power systems. Now, this new system, we can call it a system with oligarchies ruling everywhere. Oligarchy is not a specificity of Russia as it is presented usually by the Western media. you have an oligarchy, the same oligarchy ruling the United States. You know, when in Wall Street the people demonstrated saying we the 99%, which means that the system is ruled by 1%, the oligarchy. In fact, and exclusively that, you have oligarchies, same type of oligarchies in the Western European and Japan systems. You have oligarchy in the former socialist countries of the Soviet bloc. You have oligarchies or comprador oligarchies, neo-oligarchies in the southern countries. Now, that system has led very quickly, has been felt very quickly by the laboring classes and by the people in general, particularly in the South, as not acceptable, neither politically, nor socially, nor economically, nor culturally even. And therefore, you had a start of big moves to move out of this pattern of a world with a hegemony, the hegemony of the U.S. and its subordinate allies of Europe and Japan, move out of it towards reconstructing a polycentric system of global for the world. Now, that takes a variety of forms. It has started in Latin America with we can call them revolutionary progressive advances in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and elsewhere potentially also. 20 or 30 years ago it has started. Then you had the popular revolts, particularly more recently in the Arab countries, in Tunisia and in Egypt particularly. But before that, you had equally popular revolts in the Philippines against Marcos, in Indonesia against Suharto, in Mali, in Africa, against the dictator Moussa Traoré, etc., etc. Now, this is visibly questioning the continuation of the pattern of globalization with hegemony and with no room in the autonomy for the societies and states and countries of the South. Another pattern, of course, of questioning that globalization is precisely the strategy of China, which, as I'm saying, is not a strategy of just participating to the global system, but along with participating to the global system, maintaining and developing its own internal national project that is with its social dimension of associating, of having the vast majority of the people benefiting, even if very unequally, but still benefiting, with a pattern of renovation of the rural society, not destruction of the rural society, but renovating it, and with the pattern of creating a national integrated system of modern industries, and with giving more and more importance to the internal market, along with its participating to the international market. Now, these are creating the conditions for moving back to the Bandung spirit. The Bandung spirit was a spirit of solidarity among the peoples, that is the popular classes, the nations as a historical reality, and the states, the governments of a large number, if not all, of countries of Asia and Africa, and we should add now and Latin America. Renovate solidarity, which was, as I said, political solidarity supporting the struggle for the reconquest of independence in Africa, particularly, and for making difficult, if not impossible, the interventions of the Western powers to stop the movement. There were small wars here and there, aggressions of imperials. I'm Egyptian, and in 1956, that is 1 year after Bandung, the Western powers, Britain and France particularly, with their Israeli allies, attempted to destroy the Egyptian experience of Nasser, the starting experience of Nasser, by a war. But these were limited wars because precisely there was this global solidarity of the peoples, the nations and states of the South, and there was the support of the Soviet Union and China to their independent policies. Now, we cannot have a remake today of Bandung. There are no remakes in history, precisely because the social structures have changed dramatically, not necessarily to the worse everywhere, and because precisely of that exclusive or almost exclusive power conquered by the oligarchies here and there. But we can have another pattern, a new pattern of globalization, negotiated globalization, with solidarity among the states of the South vis-à-vis states of the South plus Russia, vis-à-vis the imperialist triad, US, Europe and Japan. Now, China has started a number of initiatives in this direction. The Shanghai group, for instance, the rapprochement coming closer to Russia. Russia is perhaps moving from neoliberalism to a new pattern of state capitalism with a social dimension. And we can see that the same challenge, the peoples of the South are confronted to the same challenge. I conclude by saying that what we need and what is historically possible is precisely not a remake, but in the same spirit as Bandung was, compelling imperialism to retreat. It will not disappear, but to retreat, to accept the fait accompli of the national independence of countries of the South, and to accept a multipolar pattern of social and economic change. Thank you.